Mr. President.
Senator from New Mexico.
Mr. President, I come to the floor today to oppose this effort by my good colleague from Alaska and by congressional Republicans to, in my view, turn back the clock 100 years on the management of our native wildlife on our national wildlife refuges in Alaska. Since 2002, the Alaska Game Department of Fish and Game has embraced what some have called a politically driven and even unscientific regime of intensive predator control. I think it's helpful to look at the views of a former governor of Alaska, Tony Knowles, who recently commented in High Country News. He said, quote, "The most disappointing thing is that the balance of the views on the Board of Game has disappeared. I tried to work with a balanced board that reflected subsistence hunters, sport hunters, guides, and conservationists, but now the board is made up of people who want to make hunting ungulates the priority for wildlife management. There's been a focused effort to dramatically reduce populations of wolves, coyotes, and bears, and the methods and means they've used are both unscientific and unethical," end quote. Not my quote, but that of former Governor Tony Knowles of Alaska. In addition, in the past decade, the Alaska Board of Game and the department have turned their back, I think, on a long history of not only working together between federal and state agencies, but embracing ethics as central to wildlife management, not just to maintain the viability of that management, but to maintain the support of the public for that management. This relatively new approach that actively seeks to eschew the long history of embracing sporting ethics can best be summed up by a quote from Doug Vincent Land, the former director of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game's Division of Wildlife Conservation. He said, quote, "The professionals at the Alaska Department of Game and Fish did not feel it was our role to judge the ethics of these practices," end quote. The result of this ethics-free approach is now glaringly obvious when considering some of the methods of take that have been approved over time for native predators in Alaska. Shooting of mother grizzlies with cubs, aerial gunning of wolves, killing wolf pups in their dens, using spotlights at bear dens, baiting of bears, and allowing for the wanton waste of black bear meat are a few of the practices that Alaska Board of Game has approved. Aldo Leopold, the father of modern wildlife conservation, once said, quote, "Ethical behavior is doing the right thing when no one else is watching, even when doing the wrong thing is legal," end quote. Now, I know it's become fashionable in some hunting circles recently to ignore the importance of ethics to our way of life. Yet if our greatest leaders are any indication, that is at best a slippery slope to irrelevance. This cartoon is a good reminder. It's from the early 20th century, at a time when President Teddy Roosevelt was invited down the Mississippi for a black bear hunt. When he wasn't successful, they tied a black bear to a tree. I think this cartoon from that period is a good reminder of how TR viewed the importance of sportsmanship and ethics in hunting as central to what maintains our credibility. Today, politicians jump at the chance to embrace his reputation, but too often they have not followed his example. So while shooting sow grizzlies with cubs may be legal, I suspect the public will never view it as ethical. And I have to wonder what good old TR would have to say about recent decisions to allow things like unlimited bag limits on black bear cubs, or baiting of bears, or shooting female grizzlies with cubs. So why does all this ethics stuff matter so much to hunters? Why does it matter to me? It matters because hunters like me are a small minority of the population in this country. We're less than 5% by most counts. And we are able to carry on this great tradition because the vast majority, the non-hunting public, 95% of the population, sees us as effective and ethical stewards of our country's native wildlife. We have embraced the North American model of wildlife conservation that has literally brought elk and deer and wild turkey and species we think of as common today, Canada geese, for example, back from the brink of extinction. And the public shares in that success when they enjoy wildlife. And that is true even if they never hunt, never pick up a fishing pole. We as hunters also have the trust and the respect of the public because we are willing to literally spend billions of dollars of our own money to protect, conserve, and manage those resources with the best available science. The Alaska Game Board's decision to ignore the latest science on the importance of predators to healthy prey populations is indicative of a desire to effectively turn caribou and moose populations into livestock and to manage for maximum numbers and maximum tag revenue. Now, ironically, that approach has been ineffective, certainly ineffective at boosting and maintaining historically high caribou and moose numbers. This is an example of a graph of the moose population over time. You can see back in 2002 when these sort of intensive take measures went into place. Intensive predator control, pre-intensive management, post-intensive management. If you can discern a consistent correlation to an outcome of higher moose numbers there, you're doing better than I am. And this would all be fine if this was just happening on state lands in Alaska, perchance. But unfortunately, the Alaska Game Board now seeks to suppress healthy predator populations on our national wildlife refuges, the very places set aside to protect and preserve our native wildlife, even predators, even black bears and grizzlies and wolves. Let that sink in for a moment. This is about embracing unscientific wildlife management on the very refuges that belong to each and every American citizen. Not Alaska state land, but our national wildlife refuges. People save up for years, sometimes decades, and travel thousands of miles to go to places like the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge so they can see a grizzly bear fish for salmon. Does it make sense to allow these kind of extreme measures of take, to allow for grizzlies with cubs to be killed in those refuges? And will these policies actually benefit the hunting public? I would argue that they do not. Not one of my colleagues can deny how much I love to hunt and fish. Many of my life's best memories have been forged around the campfire with my friends and family at elk camp. Just this past Christmas break, both of my boys joined me for what would be my son Carter's very first elk hunt. This is a picture of us in the Continental Divide Wilderness Study Area. After days of hard hunting, hiking miles through the rough and tumble backcountry of the Continental Divide, WSA, my son Carter harvested his first elk. He soon learned that the real work starts after you pull the trigger. He labored long and hard to make sure that every scrap of meat from that animal made its way from the wilderness to our freezer. Anything less would be unethical and disrespectful to that magnificent animal. My son takes great pride in the meals that elk provides for our family and our friends. And he knows that hunting is conservation and that we have a responsibility to hand these wildlife resources off to the next generation unimpaired. I'm proud that even at 13, he takes that responsibility very seriously. You know, some of my son's classmates in school are vegetarians. Too many of those who do eat meat think that it is created, as my colleague from Alaska said, on a styrofoam platter wrapped in cellophane. He knows better. And as someone who hunts and fully embraces the ideas of sustainability and ethics, the next generation of sportsmen and women couldn't have a better ambassador to this new generation of millennials for why hunting is actually critical to the future of wildlife. That, my friends, is what this CRA before us, in my view, puts at risk. When you vote to put the federal stamp of approval on methods of take that the public views as objectionable, even unethical, when you allow that ideologically driven style of game management to even permeate the sanctity of our national wildlife refuges, I don't think that's standing up for hunters. I fear that it's endangering the future of something that is critical to culture and way of life. As I said before, the number of active hunters in the U.S. today, I think it sits around 5%, maybe a little lower. I hope not. By voting for this CRA, we are risking the confidence of the general public in our ability as hunters to be the best stewards of our wildlife resources. That, Mr. President, is a risk that I am not willing to take. So I would urge all of my colleagues to stand up for our nation's wildlife, to stand up for our national wildlife refuges, and to vote no on this proposal. Mr. President, with that, I would note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.